Forgiveness is at the heart of every relationship. Forgiveness is at the heart of the message of Jesus, but it's also the heart of every relationship. It's the heart, I'd say, the whole of the history of the world. Forgiveness or refusal to forgive. It's eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You've hurt me, so I'll hurt you. Jesus came as the Lamb who took away the sin of the world. And sin is this barrier around our hearts. And this barrier prevents us being in relationship to God, in relationship to other people, but also in relationship to what is deepest in myself. And this barrier protects us. And if we've been hurt, we want to hurt. Today we're going to talk about the forgiveness of Jesus. We're going to talk about guilt and how in some way to be relieved of guilt. I think in all of us there's guilt. We're frightened. We're frightened of people seeing us as no good, frightened of seeing us as bad. And if they see us as bad, maybe then we'll be rejected and we'll be all alone. So there's a tendency in us always to pretend that we're good, that we're intelligent, that we are called for esteem of people. I'd like to just tell you the story of John, who's in my own community, and he suffered a great deal as a child. He wasn't wanted by his parents, and very quickly he was put with his grandparents. The grandparents didn't want him because he appeared as a nuisance and he used to cry and run around. And so he's put with a family placement. The first family placement couldn't keep him. He went to another family placement, and finally a third family placement, and eventually he ended up in the psychiatric hospital. He was always seen as a nuisance. Nobody ever wanted him. So grew up within him the sentiment of, I'm no good. Nobody can love me. And creates inside of him that broken self-image. This is what we call psychological hate, psychological guilt, or some people call it shame. Because in point of fact, it touches the very foundation of that man. A sense that he is no good, and that he can do no good, and that he is of no value. This psychological guilt is imposed upon us from outside. Moral guilt is when we think we're okay, but we've done something wrong. And we know we've done something wrong, and that we've done an act which we shouldn't have done, we've hurt someone, and so on. So we have these two forms of guilt, which in point of fact are intertwined. Because with the psychological guilt of, I am no good, well then, because I'm no good, I'll do things that are no good. And so the whole question is how to relieve people from guilt. All of us, we're carrying a lot of this guilt because we don't know how to love. Husbands don't know how to love their wives. Wives don't know how to love their husbands. Children don't know how to love their parents. Parents their children. We're all hurting each other. And then we come to this situation is just this sentiment that I am no good, that I can't do anything of any value. So let's come to this gospel story today and see what happens. Jesus is teaching in the temple, and suddenly a commotion. Some men come rushing in with a woman who is half naked. They're pulling her in and throws her in front of Jesus. And they say, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. Moses says that women like that should be stoned. What do you say? You see, they're trying to test Jesus. See, up until now, Jesus has spoken a lot about forgiveness. He says he came not for the just, but for sinners. He came to forgive. He came to reveal the love for every person. And so if he says we must forgive this woman, then he's going against Moses. If on the other hand he says, well, here's a case she has to be stoned, well, in this case, he's contradicting himself. And so these men are trying to put Jesus in a situation where he's contradicting himself. And then he's obviously not the Messiah. He's not a prophet. He's contradicting himself. So they're really testing him, trying him. Jesus bends down, starts writing in the dust, in the soil. And then says, "What do you say?" And so he looks up, and he just says, "Let the one who is without sin, let him throw the first stone." And he bends down again and starts writing. And the story says that they start leaving, one after another, beginning with the eldest, because it was always the eldest who threw the first stone. In this gospel event, we see three trials are taking place. There's essentially the trial of Jesus, because these men want to trap Jesus. There's the trial of the woman who has committed adultery. And then there's the trial of these men, these rather vicious men. And behind each one of these trials, there's fear. First of all, there's the fear of these men who want to try Jesus. What are they frightened of? Jesus appears as a prophetic figure announcing a message of love. In some way, he's threatening some people. His proximity to those that are called sinners, who are frequently condemned and pushed aside. His proximity to the poor and to the weak. The way he spoke of his relationship with his Father, all this is rather frightening for some of the religious authorities. And they're frightened also because maybe Jesus will create a revolution. If he's the Messiah, and maybe some people are talking about him as the Messiah, and if people start coming to him and going after him and so on, and if he leads a revolution, well, then maybe the Roman armies will come and create direct rule instead of indirect rule from Rome to Jerusalem. So you see in these men, they're trying to get rid of Jesus. He's becoming a nuisance. Like a lot of prophetic figures can be a nuisance, like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. They become a nuisance because in some way they're answering or announcing a truth of justice. So there's the trial of Jesus, and what these men want is they're using the woman, but in order to condemn Jesus. Then we have the trial of this woman. She's been caught in the act of adultery. Had it been planted or not, we don't know. Nothing is said, but she's obviously terribly scared. Does anyone know about it? What about her husband and her children and so on? So she's frightened, she's ashamed, and we're talking about stoning her to death. So she's petrified. She's in a state of absolute fear of death. And then we have the trial of these men. Because these men, there's something vicious inside of them. And they're not yet quite conscious of all that is vicious in them. And as I say, they're using this woman to condemn Jesus. But the very words of Jesus seems to bring them to look into themselves. Jesus says, "Whoever is without sin, let him throw the first stone." So somewhere inside of them, they are becoming conscious that there is sin within them. In the story, we see Jesus bending down. I find that very moving. These men are standing up, shouting, and he is bending even maybe lower than the woman. Somewhere, Jesus is the Word who descended into humanity, into flesh. And so he's down there in the bottom of humanity. He doesn't stand up and say, strong, no. And his words, let him who is without sin throw the first stone, are the words of great beauty. He's not judging anyone or anything. He's just revealing a truth. And revealing that truth, he's saying to these men, there is sinfulness inside of you. But he's not accusing. He's not judging. He just says that very gentle phrase, you see, in a way, truth is the greatest weapon, if I may use that expression, against insolent might. Truth. What I find very moving in this scene is the silence of Jesus. These men come and shout at him and want an answer. He doesn't answer, just bends down. You see, Jesus didn't come to judge people. He came to reveal to people that they are beautiful, that they have value. And the whole of the mystery of Jesus is that revelation that people have value. And then when they discover that they have value, because love responds to love. If we discover that we are loved by Jesus, then we'll want to respond to that love of Jesus. So Jesus, bending down, is saying, I don't want to answer, because all I want in one way to be close to this woman, to save her. But I want to be close also to these men, to help them discover how beautiful they are, and that their fear is covering up their real human beauty and value. They've got caught up in a world of anger and fear. So the silence of Jesus, and then those incredible words, that the one of you who is without sin, let him throw the first stone. Jesus is just helping people to discover, yes, there is sin in us, but he's come to forgive. This story is telling us something about Jesus and about the love of Jesus for us. But it's also in some way revealing something in ourselves. You see, somewhere inside of us, because we feel guilty, and I've mentioned that we don't know how to love people, somewhere, maybe are we seeking to be punished? And then do we create a God who will punish? Because somewhere in our education, there is the powerful God telling us you mustn't do this, and if you do, bang. And we have a lot of difficulty with unconditional love. And so, because we feel guilty, there's something very deep in the human nature. When we feel guilty, we sometimes want to hurt ourselves. That's somewhere the basis of masochism, that we want to hurt ourselves because we feel guilty. So something is being told to us about this incredible love of Jesus for each one, who's come to take away all these blockages to help us to rise up. I'd like to tell you a story which I lived, and it's a very moving story, to show how difficult it is about judging, how to judge people, and then not to judge. I was quite some years ago in Kingston Maximum Security Prison, and I was speaking in the gymnasium to quite a number of hundreds of men. And when I speak to men who are inmates in prisons, I always feel a certain poverty and how to reach them. And because somewhere I understand the depth of their pain, their anger, and all sorts of things. So normally what I do is talk about people like John, feelings of guilt, and how they're yearning to be loved, and their need to find people who appreciate them. And so I gave a whole talk, and I remember speaking particularly about a young man called Eric, who was blind and deaf, an incredibly beautiful person. When I finished talking, a man got up and screamed at me. I mean, he was a very powerful, strong man. And he said, "You've had it easy. You know nothing about our life." And if another man comes into this prison and talks about love, I'll kick his bloody head in. And there was a sort of silence. And I felt I had my back to the wall. And I just asked Jesus to give me the right answer, because I wanted to. So I was at peace. And I said to the man, you know, I really understand what you're saying. You see, it's true, I don't know what you're living. I don't know all that you've. But would you permit me, just when I give talks outside of this prison, just to say what you have said then? Because it's important that people understand. And he said, yeah. And then I said to him, well, look, if I come back in this region, can I come back and share with you again? Because if people need to hear about you, sometimes it can be useful for you to hear about what people are living outside. So would you permit me to come back? And he said, yeah. There were a few more questions. And when all was over, I went right up to him and I took his hand. And I said, tell me, what is your name and where do you come from? And then I had some sort of inspiration. I said, tell me, are you married? He said, yeah. So I said to him, will you tell me about your wife? Suddenly this man started weeping. Tears came down his cheeks. And he told me that his wife was in a wheelchair and that he hadn't seen her for 2 years. Suddenly I saw what this man wanted. He was craving for tenderness. And here I, a stranger, I come in and talk about tenderness, and he can't bear it, because it's awakening very deep things. And so he yelled at me, because he just couldn't stand the inner pain, his own cry for tenderness. So we must never judge anyone, because sometimes violence comes because people haven't been loved. Let's come back now to the story. The men have left. Jesus has returned to that downward position and is writing in the sand. And then he looks up and says, woman, where are they? And then he says, has anyone condemned you? She says, no. And Jesus just says, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. Incredible tenderness in this meeting. Woman, where are they? You just sense that all the guilt and the fear of this woman has suddenly gone away. She's saved. She's liberated. And as you know, the word forgive in Greek means to liberate. So this woman, suddenly there's a liberation. In a way, she can stand up. But she's changed. She's deeply changed. Because she's seen those eyes of Jesus. Jesus, who is the prophet, maybe even the Messiah. And he's looked at her with love and said, I don't condemn you. I don't. And then he says, go and do not sin. And you see, sin is a refusal, a conscious refusal to accept the love of Jesus, the love of God. It's I don't want to be healed. And so Jesus is liberating her. Can each one of us believe those words when Jesus says, I don't condemn you? Because there is the heart of the mystery. But somewhere there's something strange in we human beings. We cling on to guilt because we can cling on to vengeance and we can cling on to depression. And so those words of Jesus are incredibly healing words. Because those words, I don't condemn you, are words which are calling us to rise up from guilt, to become men and women who are fully alive, so that then, because we have been forgiven, we can start to forgive others. But we have to be careful, because forgiveness is not an event. Forgiveness is a long process, because everything with human beings is about growth. The mystery of living is to grow, and growth is the gradual capacity to forgive. Our danger is to judge before seeing the beauty, whereas the whole message of Jesus is that gradually we are called to become men and women of peace through the power of the Spirit, so as we can see your beauty in your culture, in your religion, in your non-religion, in your humanity, in all that you are, as a person with disabilities, mental disabilities, people who have Alzheimer, people who are in AIDS, old people, to see in every one the value that is there. And to see the value is not just to do good to them, but it's to reveal to them that they can do good to us. The truth will set us free. But do we want the truth? Do we want the truth of our world? I think many people today don't want truth. They deny truth. Remember Pilate saying, "What is the truth?" And sometimes we just want tolerance. Let everybody do what they want. But we know that's not true. To have people abusing children sexually is not true. It's wrong. It's unjust. So we have to become a little bit clearer of what is this truth. Do we want to look at the world as it is and see what place we should take in it? The injustices, the wars that are there, all the difficulties in our families, the lack of communication. Do we want to see what's in ourselves? Maybe there's a whole lot of truth we don't want. So the question is really, does truth really render us free? And I believe that the Spirit of truth came to make us free, so that we can stand up and be ourselves. The history of humanity is a story of many wonderful people. Socrates, that incredible man who, in Athens at that time, there were a whole lot of what I'd call false philosophers, getting money and pretending that they had knowledge and so on. And so Socrates would come along and question them and show that they didn't know. So there was a trial, a false trial, because they wanted Socrates, he was doing bad to the young. And so Socrates would say, Athenians, I love you, but I'll always obey God more than you. When eventually he was condemned to death, and he stood up in front of the judges and he said, I thank you. See, of two possibilities. When you kill me, either I will go to sleep forever, and I love sleep, so I want to thank you. I'll get out of this terrible world where everybody's fighting. Or else, I'll go into another world where the judges are more just than you. And I will meet the friends of others, of other times. He stood up to be true. And this is the story of many women and men today. I like to talk to you of Annie Patchen, a Tibetan nun, 26 years in prison when the Chinese invaded Tibet. 26 years, 9 months in a hole where she could not distinguish day from night. And in a tiny hole, just tall enough for her, high enough and wide enough. And she said, in order to have my spirit unbroken, I did 100,000 prostrations before the God of compassion. She remained free. Or somebody like Aung San Suu Kyi, that incredibly beautiful Burmese lady who's still living, who stands up as opposition to military power. Incredibly beautiful woman. She is free. The question is, do we want to be free in front of insolent might? Are we frightened that if we're free, we'll be pushed aside? I remember one young woman who came to see me. She was an assistant in L'Arche, a good young woman. And I asked her to tell me about her life, and she did. And she told me that she'd done studies at the Sorbonne. And I said, what studies? Music. And I said, well, why did you study music? And she said, well, my mother wanted me to study music. And then as the conversation went on, it was all, mother wanted me, mother wanted me. And you, what do you want? You remember those first words of Jesus? What are you looking for? What is your deepest personal desire? Where does your conscience come up? You see, the whole question is, we are not called to be people who live under blind obedience or blind revolt. It's somewhere let our conscience come up so that we seek truth, that we seek justice. How is it that conscience is not brought up and that we're just obliged to do what everybody else wants us to do, so that we're slaves to what others want and we're not standing up, we're not free people, and yet we're called to be free people? The birth of conscience will frequently come when parents say to their children, I am sorry, I have done wrong. Parents can give the impression that they are God, that all law, that they have law, that they are the ones that are just. Children know that there are times when parents are not just, when they get angry and the children didn't do it. So children know. It's when the parents ask forgiveness, because over the parents there's a universal truth. There is truth. There's a universal justice. There is justice. There is a universal God, not just the God of my little group, but the God of all people. The God who is the God of creation, the God who put these incredibly beautiful laws in the whole of reality. And when parents ask forgiveness, children realize there's something above mom and dad. And mom and dad should submit to truth, to justice, and to faith. And so then the personal conscience can begin to grow, because what is important for you and me is to seek truth. You see, there is such a thing as truth as there are lies. A little boy who says that he didn't take any food from the Frigidaire and he had, that's a lie. It's not true. He did take it. But somewhere he's frightened of truth, frightened of being spanked, frightened. There's such a thing as fake gold, just as there is true gold. So we can pretend, we can live in a world of pretense where there is no truth, and yet we are called to become men and women who really are seeking the truth and letting their personal conscience come up, not to be blindly obedient, not to be blindly in revolt, but men and women who are truly seeking truth. You see, truth is reality. To live in reality. One of our dangers today is that through television, I'm sorry, and through videos and through films, we can live in a world which is purely the imagination. We can cut ourselves off from truth. Sometimes people can laugh when they see somebody who's maybe psychotic or in hallucinations and thinks that he is Napoleon or he is somebody great, and they can laugh about it. I live with some people who are psychotic. I live with some people who go into hallucinations, and they can pretend they're someone else. But if you knew the pain that is behind that, because they flip into hallucinations because of the pain of living in reality. And when eventually they can find the right medication and the right reality where they're accepted, the hallucinations become less. So people who are in this psychotic world, they're outside of reality. It is not true. You're not Napoleon. You can't say that. But what you can say is discover to love them as they are and help them to discover that reality is not awful, that reality is beautiful. But we have to be helped to enter into that. And we are helped when somebody loves us as we are. You don't have to be what others want you to be. You can just be yourself. You have a handicap, difficulty in walking, maybe blind. That is painful. Obviously it's painful. But if we get together, we can help each other. The person who has difficulty walking to walk a little bit better. But if we appreciate everybody, if we see in everybody their gift, well then we won't be frightened of being just myself. I see that in myself. The broken parts of my being. There are parts where I hide behind barriers or I'm frightened of relationships. Or when there's conflict, I see that inside of me I get upset. Okay, that's who I am. I don't have to pretend that that isn't inside of me. It is there. What I have to is to discover that I can grow. Because I'm not just those blockages, there's also beautiful things inside of me. And the whole question of truth for us is that to accept that I have gifts, I have competence, but I have things that don't work well in me, psychological difficulties. I have difficulties in relationship with some people. And it's okay to be like that. I can gradually grow. Our danger is either we think we are perfect or else we're just the scum of the earth. We're neither the scum of the earth, we're neither perfect, we are human beings. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Incredible words. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. It's not easy to walk in darkness. I'm sure many of us, we've had the occasion to walk at night, maybe in a wood or somewhere where there's no electric light or we have no flashlight, and we can fall and lose our way. So darkness is something which is frightening, because we can lose our way and we can hurt ourselves. And you know that darkness in the biblical sense is not just that there's no sun or no light. Darkness is all the world of darkness, is seduction, because we can be pulled in various directions into slavery. We can get so caught up in having things that we become slaves to things. We're not free people. So the whole mystery is that Jesus will lead us to the light. Now what is this vision of Jesus? Jesus came to lead us to compassion, to this inner freedom which will allow us to accept every person just as they are. But we know this is a struggle, because there's the seduction of many elements which pulls us away from this openness to people, to struggling for peace. we have to reflect, you, me, and us all, what fundamental direction do we want to give our lives to? What do we really want to do? That comes back again to that fundamental question of Jesus, what are you looking for? What is the direction? And that, of course, is also, do you really believe in yourself? Do you really believe that you are beautiful? Do you believe that the light of life is in you, that there is life within you that can give life to people? To discover that truth. But the big question is, how is it that we don't discover this beautiful life that is within us? Human sciences, particularly since Freud, but there's been an incredible development of human sciences about, why people do things and motivations. And of course has been uncovered in all of us, is what we call the shadow area, the unconscious part of our being, where there's a lot of darkness. And we don't want to know about this darkness. But it's important to try and understand how that darkness comes up, how this shadow area, this part that we don't want to look at. You see, children, during the very first months, they yearn to be loved through touch, through the tone of the voice, a love also which springs from man and woman who love them. If there's conflict between man and woman, there'll be fear in the child. But what happens in all of us is that at one time we're hurt. Sometimes the hurts are terrible. Abuse, violence, sexuality, conflicts, and so on. And then, of course, that child yearning to be loved is not. And he senses that he's no good, that he's of no value, and so on. But what happens then in the child when he senses that he's not loved? Anger. Hate can even come up. I just think of my own story. At one moment when I was asked to do something, my grandfather saw me and he said that I was certainly going to become a delinquent, because lying on the floor screaming, my legs going up and down and so on, maybe I am a bit of a delinquent. But somewhere there was anger in front of my parents. But how can a child be angry to his parents? Because if the parents, they're God in some ways. They give the food, they look after. A child cannot do it by himself. And so these angers, which in some way are totally justified, are seen as to the child as something evil, as if there's a wolf inside of him or inside of her. And so we have to quelch this, push it down, forget our angers. We have to be good. We have to obey our parents in some way. And so all this sort of dark area within us, we cover over. So all the question then is discovering who I am and be able to say, I am this person. Incredible thing is this is the name of Jesus. Jesus says, I am. And he takes there the name that God had revealed himself. At one time, the people who are discussing with Jesus say, who are you? This is the same question that Moses asked of God. When the Israelites asked me who your God is, who God is, what shall I say? And God says, I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, I am has sent you. The name of Jesus. And Jesus says that when the Son of Man will be lifted up on the cross, lifted up on the resurrection, lifted up as he enters into God, I will draw all people towards me. I am. And at one moment, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And the whole question of truth is to discover that when Jesus says, I am, and that the truth will set me free, that I too, I can say, I am. When some of the Pharisees and scribes who were there heard Jesus saying, "I am the light of the world," they're angry. How can anyone say, "I am the light of the world"? And so they come into, "Well, where are you from? Who are your father?" And it's there that Jesus will reveal to him who he is. I am. None of us have the truth. The truth possesses us. It brings us to freedom. And it brings us to freedom to love people as they are and to see the truth that is in them. That truth can be hidden under a lot of violence, but that truth is your beauty. And your beauty is your capacity to become free. Your beauty is the capacity to love. Your beauty is your capacity to be compassionate. And that can take time, because we're on a road. And this desire to be possessed by truth can take a long time. But this is our growth. We human beings, we are called to grow to truth and to freedom. Jesus says, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciple, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Free to be myself, freedom to be I am. That implies also that I've asked forgiveness, because there are a lot of things that are broken in my life, and we are all broken people. We are all sinners, let's face it. And so the whole question is the discovery of who I am, but also I can grow to greater love. And of course, if the truth sets me free, we can set other people free, because freedom is contagious, it's infectious. If I am free, because freedom is what we all want. We don't want to be slaves to what other people think we should be or are. We want to be ourselves and to discover the incredible beauty that is within us. So Jesus is calling us to be free and set people to be free. And it's the truth. But the truth is not something we possess. It's something we are possessed by. We never possess God. God possesses us. He holds us. He loves us. So truth is something incredibly beautiful, and it renders and makes us become very little, very humble, because the truth is something that is given to us. The truth is something that we submit to. The truth is something that brings us to freedom. It's not something we have or to possess. And one of the dangers is that we can hurt people. We can offend them. I have the truth, you don't. And that means that I am superior to you. When we are possessed by the truth, when we are possessed by God, when we live in God, when we abide in the Word of God, well, then we see the truth in each person. And that's what God does. God sees the truth in you, and He sees it in me. It can be completely covered over with a lot of mess. But God sees under the mess. He sees our fundamental beauty in every person, even in those that have done terrible things. And what is that fundamental person? It's your beauty of your capacity to love. It's your capacity to give life. And that can come as some of those messy things can gradually be taken away. And then the incredible beauty can come up. And the wonderful thing is that Jesus meets us under the mess. And He says, you are precious. And I want you to be precious, to discover your preciousness, and then you'll be able to give life to others. Then we discover how the truth sets us free, and we can free other people. Do we really want to see? In a Presbyterian songbook, hymnal, there's a very beautiful song which I understand was actually written in about 1200 and something by a certain Richard, and it was used in Godspell. It's Mary of Magdala singing to Jesus, "Dear Lord, 3 things I pray: to love you more dearly, to see you more clearly, to follow you more nearly, day by day, day by day." In a way, this is my prayer, and I hope it's the prayer of all of us, to see the truth more clearly. But so often we don't want to see the truth. We don't want to see the truth of the world, and we don't want to see the truth of ourselves. So we seek many distractions to keep our mind away and our eyesight away from the essential. And we can even put a lid on a lot of things which we just don't want to look at because we're frightened, and because what responsibility have I if I begin to see all the injustice everywhere? What can I do? So to see things more clearly can bring me to despair. So maybe it's easier not to see things more clearly. It's better in some way to forget, and for each one of us just to go on our journey not seeing things. To see things more clearly is maybe a call to change. And somewhere we don't really believe, or many of us don't believe, that change is possible. We don't really believe in this capacity we have as human beings to give life to others. So the story today is about seeing things more clearly. Jesus and the disciples have just come from the temple. There's been rather a hard discussion. They want to kill Jesus. Jesus is a disturbance. He's talked about being the light of the world, that he existed before Abraham. So people are upset, angry with him, and there is a desire to exclude him. And then the disciples and Jesus meet a blind beggar who is excluded from society. And I just have some little sense that Jesus, feeling excluded, feels closer to excluded, to this particular blind beggar. And these disciples say to Jesus, looking at this man, they say, "This man born blind, whose fault is it? Was it because of his sins or the sins of his parents?" As I say, this is a very fundamental question. I've had parents, like a Christian doctor not too long ago said this to me. I was present at the birth of my little girl, and when I saw that she had a severe handicap, my immediate reaction was, what have I done to God that he should send me a tragedy like that? So somewhere in the human consciousness, I don't say the Christian consciousness, I say in the human consciousness, there's a feeling that if I've given birth to bad fruit, somewhere I'm a bad tree. And so if I'm a bad tree, then I have done something wrong, or my ancestors have done something wrong. So the answer to Jesus was very strong. No, they have not sinned. He was born blind to do the work of God. And what is the work of God? It's love. People with disabilities are born for love, for them to grow in love and to call other people to love. But this is the work of all of us. This is our vocation. This is our mission, to grow in love and call others to love. You see, in many, many ways in our world, people are blind to people with disabilities. It's really interesting in this story, the disciples don't speak to the person with disabilities. They don't speak to the man who is blind. They speak about him. I don't say behind his back, but it's somewhere as if he is a nobody. He doesn't exist. So we can speak about them in front of them as if they are nobody. And the whole of the mystery of God is that they are somebody and important people. They are loved by God, that God has so chosen the weak and the poor and the fragile of this world to confound and to shame those who are powerful and strong. That's the mystery of God, is that every person is important, but so often we are blind. And I must say that for myself, it's been a sort of transformation. It's quite true that when I came to start in L'Arche, I think, I came to be generously good, to do good to people, to do good to poor people. I can say that I had no idea that they are the ones who are going to transform me. A bishop in Rome said to me not too long ago, "You people in L'Arche have created a Copernican revolution. Up until now, we say we must do good to the poor. You are saying the poor, the disabled, are doing good to you. People think that they should be healing them, where in reality they are healing those who think they are healers." And so there's a whole mystery there. And I'm really touched that in this Gospel of St. John, that there's a lot of things that are centered around people with disabilities. People shun them, push them away, many people, because they're ignorant. They do not know the incredible beauty that is there. And I must say that they have called forth in me maybe the most beautiful elements in me, my capacity to listen, to love. I think it's important to realize that if God loves the weak and those who are fragile and despised, God also loves competent people. I mean, let's not pretend that there's just one group of people. The mystery is that the weak help the strong to discover who they are, and the strong help the weak to discover who they are. So what is important is we discover we're needed, all of us in the body. You know, professional people, competent people, psychiatrists, educators, whatever it is, doctors, they are important people and God loves them. What the important thing is that we all use our gifts to serve. But let's come back to the story. There Jesus is confronted by this blind beggar. Jesus just takes some dust, spits into it, makes a little bit of mud, and then places it on the eyes of the blind beggar, and just says to him, "Go and wash in the pool of Siloam and come back." So the man goes off to the pool of Siloam, washes, and he sees. Well, then there's going to be a whole sort of situation. But before that, I just want to say, I'm touched by the way Jesus touches this man. He doesn't sort of from afar say, "Go and get healed." He approaches him, he touches him. Of course, this is very important for blind people, because that touch is very important because they don't see, but the hands of Jesus touched his face. And that was important for him. The touch, you see, is the most basic of all our five senses. And it communicates something very special. First of all, it communicates tenderness. I mean, that is the first reality that a little baby needs, the tender touch of the mother. And Jesus touches this man and in a way gives him life. And in some way we have an echo of the Genesis, where it says that the Lord God formed man out of the dust, and he breathed into his nostril with the breath of life, and he became living. So here we see this man who has this mud on his eyes, goes and washes in the pool of Siloé, and comes back living. Of course, it creates quite a stir in the neighborhood. This man who was born blind, who's been begging, and suddenly, he's suddenly there. And so people say, well, is it him? And others say, well, no, it's not. It's somebody who looks like him. And he says, no, it's really me. It's really me. So when there's been a cure like this, you have to troop over to the temple and see some of the priests of the temple, because there has to be some recognition that there was something important has happened, and there's a miracle that has happened. And so the priests of the temple say, what happened? And he explained how Jesus had put mud in his eyes and then sent him off to wash, and he had come back cured. And amongst the Pharisees there's a discussion, because some say, well, you know, it must be from God. Others say he's not from God. And they say, well, what do you say? And he said, well, he's a prophet. So let me just read the text, because it's an incredibly beautiful text and very telling. So the priests and the Pharisees called the parents, because they didn't really believe that he had been born blind and had received his sight. So they called the parents and said, is this your son? How does he now see? His parents said, we know that this is our son. We know that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we don't know. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him yourself. He's of age. He can speak for himself. So the second time they called the man and then said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Whether he's a sinner, I don't know. All I do know is that I was blind and now I see. He's really down to earth. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, and you can almost see now the mischief in his eyes. I've told you already. You wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you too want to become one of his disciples? Of course, they are furious. They reviled him. You're his disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he comes from. Well, what an astonishing thing. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man was not from God, he couldn't do anything. So they throw him out. I'm very moved by this man. He was an excluded beggar, marginalized. He's healed by Jesus, and then because of the ideology of a few men, he's again marginalized. The marginalized man becomes marginalized. And Jesus is certainly very moved by this man now who's been thrown out of the synagogue. And Jesus meets him, and Jesus looks at him and he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he looks up, the blind man looks up at Jesus and says, tell me who he is and I'll believe. And Jesus just says, it is I, the one you're looking at. And it then says, the man must have been sort of struck and in awe. He bowed down and he said, Lord, I believe. So it's an incredibly beautiful finale of this man, the excluded man, who then becomes the excluded man again, who is welcomed by Jesus. He becomes like the closest follower, a beloved of Jesus. I'm always touched by this man because he is the first one in the Gospel of John rejected because of Jesus. He is the first witness. You know that in the Greek the word witness and martyr is the same word. And in a way, this blind beggar is the first martyr, the first one who is rejected. And Jesus welcomes him. There must have been an incredible moment of when this man in awe in front of Jesus just said, "I believe, Lord." This brings us to all sorts of things. What are the things that I don't want to admit? What are the things that I don't want to see? What is that ideology? It could be a political ideology, it could be an economic ideology which refuses and prevents us seeing. It can be a cultural, a racist ideology that we know that we are the elite and therefore it is, so we're rendered incapable of seeing. I find this very often with people with disabilities. They have their ideology about people with disabilities. Whereas on the other hand, you see this man, the blind man, with an expanding consciousness. He first talks about this man, Jesus. Then he talks about the prophet. Then he talks about coming from God. And then he believes in the Son of Man. You see this blind beggar, his intelligence gradually opening up, an understanding. His eyes are opened. And it always touches me because I see in myself an expanding consciousness, an expanding truth. The truth for me is something that we grow into little by little. And if we don't want it, then we close up. Then we are stopping the work of God coming into us. It is said that Aristotle loved everything that was human. He loved to delve into all the mysteries because God is revealed through all things. God is revealed through all the centuries of holy and wonderful people. God is revealed to me in the church that I love and that I revere. But it's that expanding consciousness, and it's true that I really want to see and I want to discover. And so that prayer that to love you more dearly, yes, to see you more clearly, to see the truth that is there, and to follow you more nearly, that is my desire. But I know that there are still blockages. I have still things to work on. There are still truths that have to be revealed about myself and the world. And I know that I'm on a journey, and that journey will end the day of my death. But I give thanks for that journey. This story of the blind, marginal beggar who becomes the seeing, marginalized beggar has a very deep experience behind it, something very important. It's a whole question of the relationship between an ideology or a tradition that becomes an ideology and experience. Because we see that these Pharisees that were there, they were blocked. They refused experience. Whereas on the other hand, this blind beggar lived off experience, and yet he was respectful of tradition. He said, nobody has heard from the beginning of the world that anyone who was blind was made whole. It must have been done by somebody who was not a sinner. I mean, he had a notion of tradition. And the whole of existence is this harmony between what we have received by God, revelation, contained more or less in a tradition and a theology, and what are we experiencing. You see, right at the beginning of this gospel, we've heard about that to those who are of the Spirit, they are led like the wind. You don't know where it's coming from and you don't know where it's going to. So, and it's like that for those of the Spirit. So the important thing for disciples of Jesus is to be well rooted in tradition, in the Word of God, but very open to experience. Because there, in experience, they will see the ways of God. What I sense in myself is a tension, and I imagine that we all have that tension. On one side, there's tradition and the Word of God, which forms our intelligence, which forms our mind, and yet on the other side, there's experience. What are we touching? What are we hearing? Because God is also in the experience of what we see, and the whole of the reality of disciples of Jesus is to see God acting, living in the world. And it's bringing that understanding, on one side the Word of God, but also this experience which is going to permit us and open our consciousness to who is God, and the way God is living in our world, and the way God is calling us all forward to be men and women of hope. We're all called to be shepherds. The exercise of authority is a very basic reality of human existence. Our first experience of authority are our parents. In our days, authority is frequently seen as something imposing, coming from above. And we've lost the real notion of authority and of helping people. It's to help a weaker person to grow. So that is what shepherding is about. And in the Book of Ezekiel, I'd like to read that because in some way it tells us what shepherding is about and what bad shepherding is about. You find it in the 37th chapter of Ezekiel. And it begins with the prophet crying out, "Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the sheep." What is sensing there? You using the sheep for your own good. The weak you have not strengthened. The sick you have not healed. The crippled you have not bound up. The strayed you have not brought back. The lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them. On one side you see the anger of the Lord towards the shepherds of Israel in respect to the people of God. And on the other side, it's telling us about what shepherding is about. It's to be close to the crippled, to the sick, those that are lost. So shepherding is something very fundamental. Every child knows they need the parent to look after them, especially when they're sick, to guide them, to help them. I mean, it's a very fundamental reality. And we know that a lamb evokes tenderness, kindness. We also know that children can be frightened of wolves, the big bad wolf, even if they've never seen one. So children know what shepherding is about. Adolescents need also models that's going to help them to find what adulthood is about. Young people are searching, and many people are searching, spiritual fathers and spiritual mothers who lead them into a life of prayer, into compassion, to understanding the whole of the gospel message. Other young people are seeking gurus who will bring them into an Asiatic religion, into Buddhism and so on. But everybody are needing models. Even those who have had no parenting, or very abusive or angry or violent parents, they're seeking models maybe in gang leaders, power, or maybe just with singers. But all of us, we're looking for these models. But to become a good shepherd is not easy. But Jesus will give us some indications about what are the qualities that are needed in a good shepherd. The first thing Jesus says, he knows his sheep, her sheep, by name. It's a very beautiful expression. To know somebody by name, to know their uniqueness. You are special. To love someone is always to reveal to somebody their uniqueness, to understand also their pain and what their needs are. So a good shepherd is somebody who knows people, their people by name. And then Jesus says the good shepherd leads people in the right direction. What does that mean? Help people to grow to greater freedom. Help children, adults, to develop their consciousness. Help people to take initiatives. Don't just tell people what to do, but to help them to become what they're called to be, and to lead them in a direction of life, not to death, where they receive life and also can give life. Later in the text we'll see that also a good shepherd gives their life for their sheep. So Jesus, when he says that he is the good shepherd, he's also showing us how I am called to be a good shepherd, how you are called to be a good shepherd. But can I ask you a question? Who are those people, or the person, who helped you to become who you are? Who is that person that inspired you, gave you a desire to live? And if you discover that, then in some way you'll discover how you are called to be a good shepherd. Who gave you life so that you can give life? For myself, I must say I've been fortunate, because I had parents who loved me and helped me to grow. My dad, who really trusted me and permitted me to enter the Navy when I was 13, when I was in Canada. And then I met Père Thomas Philippe, a Dominican priest, who saw somewhere in me things that I hadn't seen. He saw something about my own beauty, my call to prayer, things that I didn't know. So he guided me in the right direction. He loved me and he guided me. To be a good shepherd, we need to have had a good shepherd. That's what we all need. To become a model, we must have had a model. And so everything around shepherding is that. But to be a shepherd means to grow in maturity. You see, to be a good shepherd is not just to see people who they are and to see their uniqueness, but it's also to reveal who I am. Somewhere there's a revelation that it becomes a moment of communion. You see, there's no education, no teaching, no form of shepherding or helping people to grow unless there is trust. I trust you and you trust me. You know what breaks down faith? What breaks down any communication? It is what they call the double message. I say one thing and I do another. I had a very deep experience somewhere of a double message. I was with a video with some French young people, and my role was to question them. There were 4 or 5 young people, 16 to 18, and my role was to help them to talk. And they'd been on drugs, and I asked them what the experience of being on drugs was, and they spoke a bit of what they had lived. Then I said to them, how were your parents when you had drugs? What was their reaction? And they said that pretty well all 4 of them said they were very angry. So I said, well, what was your reaction in front of their reaction? One of them said to me, he looked at me with sort of anger, and he said, Monsieur, my father is an alcoholic. And he said that with a sort of, what was he saying? How can my father tell me not to take drugs when he's alcoholic? That is what you call the double message. It wouldn't have been a double message if the father had said, look, my son, I'm alcoholic. I have a lot of difficulty stopping it, but I'm really asking you to stop. But I know I'm at fault also. That is not a double message, it's truth. But when there is a double message, that breaks all trust, all education, because anyone who says one thing and lives another, that's death. Because the only way of educating people, the only real way of educating people is through my flesh, through my life. It's to reveal the life that is within me, and then to put a word on it. We educate people by the way we live, not so much by what we say. I said that a good shepherd needs to be mature. That does not mean the good shepherd, a shepherd, needs to be perfect. Because none of us are perfect, let's face it. But a good shepherd is somebody who is true. That is to say, if they've done wrong, and they haven't done things as they should, they say. And then trust is born. But shepherding is not an easy reality, because to shepherd, a mother doesn't act in the same way with a little girl of 5 to a young woman of 15. When with 5, maybe you speak more. At the age of 15, it's something else. So to be a shepherd is to grow to that maturity where I sense what you need with your age, what you need today. And it's a gradual listening to the other person, helping that person to take initiatives, helping that person to make decisions themselves, helping that person to augment their consciousness, to develop their personal conscience. But let's face it, shepherding is not easy. I have been leader of a community for a long time, and I was a leader for a long time, and there are many things that I found difficult. The first thing, when you're leading, you get a lot of criticism, because not everybody can be happy with every decision. That's not possible. So you get always people who are angry. I often say that when you're leading people, some will want to throw an arrow into you, but they'll never put it in the heart. They'll put it in the leg. They'll lame you as leader. You see, what a leader then must be a model of forgiveness. A parent must be a model of forgiveness. Every leader must be a model of forgiveness. And it's as we grow together as a model of forgiveness that we trust each other. But also leaders, and I've seen this in myself, you can want to control people. It's not always easy to have people in a community who themselves have developed their personal conscience, and they know what they want, and they oppose you, and they say they don't like this or they don't like that. And so one can be wanting to control people, to keep the power. And so some leaders are controllers, and what controllers do is that they bring in people who are not too good. A real leader must hire people better than themselves. A leader who's not a good leader, who's rather a manager, will always take in people who they hire who are no good, or not too good, who cannot grow, who cannot oppose. So you have those leaders who are frightened and control. You have others who are frightened and don't say anything to anyone. You know, let everybody do what they like. They're frightened of conflict, so they make no decisions and so on. So to find that halfway measure, to be true, to be forgiving, to listen to those who are maybe more intelligent than yourself and to really take into account what they're saying, to not run away when there's conflict, but to be there, and gradually to discover a certain wisdom. I found in myself times when I became quite violent, when I was threatened even by people with disabilities. I remember in one particular situation of a man called Lucien who would scream and scream and scream. I was not then leader of the community. When I left the leadership, I went and lived in a little home where there were about 10 people with severe disabilities. And what touched me, more than touched me, was the screamings of Lucien awoke my own scream. Because when one's a leader, there is always somebody who gets your goat, who makes you climb the wall, who awakens your own anguish. And Lucien, the scream and the tone of his voice awoke a lot of my anguish. And I saw rising up within me anger and, I dare say, violence. And I discovered that there was a lot of violence within me. Fortunately, living in community, one can't be violent, or one cannot hit people. But I saw that I could, and it made me realize the pain of some parents of people with disabilities, even the pain of some parents, who can get very angry with their children when the children say, "No, I don't want to do it. Wash your teeth. No." And then boom, or whatever it is. I mean, I discovered in the state of Washington that in the child's hospital, the greatest syndrome was the battered child syndrome. I think I can understand that. But what I found was important, I didn't like that, to discover who I was, but to know that it's there, that there is violence within me, that there is anger within me, and then be able to talk about it, to pray about it, to discover also that God loves me as I am, and that I must work on this question. One of the features of modern life is the immense amount of technology. I remember some schools in the Ivory Coast, because they were lacking in teachers, they had a lot of teaching in the schools through television. I can understand the needs, but it's very different to be looking at a screen, somebody telling you, you're getting information, but there's no relationship. And so with this immense amount of technology we have today, there's a real danger of no relationship. We don't know how to relate. And of course, then we don't quite know, we don't have that person who trusts us and is calling us to become unique and to grow and to love other people. You see, there's so many things in our world that are pushing us to individualism, to closing up, and we're forgetting that incredible treasure, which is relationship, which is parenthood, which is helping weak people to grow. I sense this very deeply in L'Arche, because one of the most fundamental things in L'Arche, we welcome a lot of very fragile people, some with very severe disabilities, but they need people to say you are beautiful, because they're lost trust in themselves. And what is important to grow is to find trust, to find what is most beautiful in us, and then to grow, to do beautiful things with other people. The other element of the Good Shepherd, which Jesus says, is to give one's life. But he makes a comparison to thieves, hirelings, bandits, that's to say, bad shepherds, who are only shepherding for their glory, to have power, or shepherding just to have a salary. And they don't care for the sheep. What Jesus is saying is that the heart of shepherding is to care. But not just to care, it's also in some way to give their lives. What does that mean when Jesus says that the good shepherd gives his life for the sheep? He lays down his life for the sheep. What does that mean, to give one's life? To give one's life has different sense. First of all, to give one's life is to give you the treasure of my life. And the treasure of my life might be my faith. It might be what is most important for me. I don't impose it, but I reveal it. What is the most important in my life? It's somewhere to give the treasure. And in a way, to give one's life is, I have received life and I give life. I have received love and I give love. But also to give one's life is to not do what I want, not do things for my interests and my power. It's in some way to sacrifice something. A child knows when parents love them to a degree that they are prepared to sacrifice things. But I'd like to come back to old people and other people who are in difficulty. Old people are also very fragile. And today, frequently, old people can be put in a home, and nobody's telling them that they are beautiful. They need shepherds. Here the shepherd is not somebody who's doing a lot for them. The shepherd is revealing to them their uniqueness. In this text of the Good Shepherd, Jesus shows something quite gentle about death. We will see later an element of tragedy of death. But today he's talking about the cycle of death, the movement of death, which goes from life into death. And all of us, we're called to approach death in that way, to approach it that it is something beautiful, where we can give our life for others. But we're in a world, and we all know that, where we don't want to talk about death. Sometimes we say, passing away, and we don't want to confront the reality. Why? Actually, the person who dies, they go into another world of peace. A bit what Socrates said, that they go into another world where they'll find a just judge and a love. But somewhere, we're so frightened of that. You know what Freud says? You can only live if you look death in the face. Quis vult vitam para mortem. If you want to live, if you want to be fully alive, recognize that we can die. And maybe tomorrow I'll die. All my hope, if I die tomorrow, is that I will have fulfilled my life, and that I'll have transmitted a gift to others. So in this world, we don't want to pretend. We want to make people to live to, maybe we'll find an answer to all these things, and then we'll have a wonderful world with people of over 100. But maybe they've all lost their heads. But what is important is that we help people to die when the moment has come, and not to worry. But as I say, there are the tragic deaths. I have lived tragic deaths. I've lived through suicides just recently, and I know the terror of it. But I know also that life is a transmission of life, and that when I die, all I hope is to have given life.